Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. I've got CT Lucero here, and you can find more about him from ctlucero.com. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, we are here to talk about a lot of things. I think you've been sharing some really interesting insights into the future and also the past. You said that you've been kind of waiting for this time for about 7 years. Can you go more into how you look at the future as it relates to the present?
Well, it's a tricky question. How to look at the future as the present. Well, what happens is that time is formed in a certain way, and there are cyclical patterns to that. So in the same way that each week, you have Monday through Sunday, you know what's going to happen on Sunday versus what's going to happen on Monday. And so that's really the most simplified way to think about how I'm looking at time. And so the present and the future are measurable through that way because it's Sunday. And you know that you're not going to work today, the football game's on, you're going to church, whatever. And so it just happens that these time periods are much longer and they're stacked on top of each other and a lot more complicated. But we do know that today is Sunday and therefore tomorrow's Monday. And Monday is a hectic day. And so there's a lot to think about related to that. And so we've known Monday was coming for quite a while. I personally knew about it going back to about 2018, I think is when I first really investigated this particular Monday. And it's very interesting to be looking at it now and understanding how it's going to unfold.
And it reminds me of so much about history and philosophy and science, because science is all about falsifiability and predictive output. And everybody's like, oh yeah, we got science because now we can finally predict. But they're not talking about prediction in the way you're talking about it. They're talking about prediction in terms of large scale systems for what's going to happen to this atom if we do this particular thing. And it's very sort of like really about the specific content of a prediction. A little bit about time. They talk about AI being predictive and stuff like that. But we're talking about something totally different. Not totally different because actually they kind of merged or were co-created in the 1500s and the 1600s, where you had these people talking about astronomy and it got put into astrology. And so they're not separate, but one has been downplayed up until the scientism has basically been shown to be a sort of mirage. It's not real. Like we can't have a belief system out of science. What do you think about everything I just say? Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you'd love to talk about the history, I would love to talk about that, about how astrology kind of got created and everything like that.
Well, sure. What we know, first of all, it's a very interesting time for this, and I'll get into that in just a second. But what we know of the history, there's a lot there. But the important thing is that the system of astrology that I'm using, and that is really the core system, derives from Hellenistic Greece.
Yeah.
And so it really is between like 300 and like 100 BC when they first come up with this. And so it becomes a very big thing at that time and is very heavily used, and it continues on. One of the heydays of astrology is 9th century Persians. Some of the best books I have on the shelf here, some of the best information comes from there. Famously, the city of Baghdad was elected and founded for astrological reasons, and they wanted to predict, and it basically was the center of the world for 600 years. It worked very well. They did a good job. And so that's just one case study. So this has been out there for a long time, but just hearing those periods and those empires, that things have changed, things were lost. So all these Greek texts, they got translated into Latin, they got translated into Arabic, they got translated into Sanskrit and Hindi. And a lot of this material was lost. And what's happened in the last, let's say, 25 years, 30 years, is that a big translation project has occurred.
Oh, interesting.
And so a huge volume of ancient texts that have never been read by anybody in the modern world and were probably lost to almost everybody for 400 or 500 years. A lot of that's gone. And so we live in this very interesting moment where we have access to all the collective information of astrology, all the books from all the cultures, and they've been translated for the first time. And this is something that's called? Really...
What is the project called? Yeah.
Well, there's a number of people doing this. There was a famous project called It's so funny. I can't remember the name in the 90s. It was Project something, rather. Anyway, there was a group of people that specifically got together and translated some old Latin and Greek texts. But that was just the beginning of a project. And now there's people doing, one of the translators I think is worthy of mentioning is a guy named Benjamin Dykes. He translated a number of these ancient texts from Latin, and then he's also learned Arabic specifically to translate astrology texts. And so those are some of the best ones. And one of the things that's happened is we figured out that clearly, like the Persians in the 9th century had access to, Dorotheus from, 200 in Alexandria. And so their books contain snippets. And so we've been able to, figure out how it's moved around the world, and also corrected mistakes. There's transcription errors. There's books that have been available that were in Latin that were around for 500 years, and it turns out the translation was dog shit and missing 7 chapters. And so somebody found an Arabic copy from the 9th century, and now we have like a much better idea of what these people were talking about. So there's a number of well-known, famous books that really weren't accessible, if at all, and certainly not in English. And so that, combined with the fact that we have software, makes this moment, this is the third golden age of astrology. Is you're looking at it because we have
what
tools.
Is this first and second? No, the first is Hellenistic. Second is Baghdad.
I would say that the Hellenistic period and then the Persian period. There's also a very extensive Renaissance era European Western usage of this, but I don't think they had nearly as. That was more of an esoteric thing where like a handful, you're Nostradamus, he's an astrologer.
Stuff. They were just channeling stuff and seeing some Sanskrit and seeing this, and then they converted it into their romantic tradition.
Well, I'm dogging them a little bit. I think that I think many of the mistakes and the misunderstandings about astrology, which still persist and were very common in the late 20th century, and so what you may be most familiar with, a lot of that comes from the Renaissance era, where they didn't have the best information. They figured it out. They weren't totally wrong. Some of those guys clearly knew what they were doing. But I think what we have available now is far superior to anything that was available, say, in England in 1650.
Very exciting for me because I think about lost knowledge and dark ages. And recently I've come from 500 AD to 1500 AD. A lot of people call it the Dark Age. I've started to think about that differently because we never lost access to Latin. And you bring up a very good points about how the language border is the key part, and we still have a language border on the internet. So there's a bunch of stuff going on in Argentina that people outside of Argentina or outside of Latin America don't know about because they don't speak Spanish. There's also a bunch of stuff happening in China.
Argentinians don't speak Spanish either. Let's be real.
Yeah, they got their own thing. It's called lunfardo, which is like a totally crazy thing, which is banging my head against for a year in the best possible way. But ultimately, like the language border stops us from understanding a lot of what's going on. And we have I think this is the first time I've thought about this before, but there's a language border to old books as well. And we had Latin.
Yes.
So we didn't lose Latin within the Western tradition. We did lose Greek. And now I'm reading this great book by Francis Yates about the occult people, how the science grew out of practical magic, and practical magic came out of the 2nd century AD Neoplatonic magic tradition, which is all kind of wrapped up in astrology, but apparently magic is different from astrology and all these different things.
The connection there is, and actually part of my work is to separate that and demystify. But a lot of those magical traditions and things that are, often peripherally associated with astrology, astrology is just a tool they used. And so one of the key things you find, like reading old grimoires from the medieval period, what they're telling you is that you can't do these rituals just any time. You have to time them. And even medicine worked that way. Medicine was done in the Western world using astrology for like 2,000 years. Until very, very recently. You hear about things like bloodletting, and you're like, oh, they were so dumb back in the day. No, they weren't. They were exactly as smart as you are. So they weren't just bleeding people arbitrarily. There was actually a whole set of rules about this and, theories behind it. And, you can still get that information. In fact, here in New York, there's a really great library. Of course, it's all written in Latin and Greek, so I don't read those languages enough to be able to go access that material, but there's huge libraries of this material. And the thing what you find is that the medical and predictive and body knowledge that they use that was, connected to astrology is still very, very useful. And it's, shockingly accurate. I'll give you an example. I read a chart for someone in Los Angeles a couple years ago. And I'd never met this woman before. She was a friend of a friend. And I saw something in there. And so I asked her, when you were young, did you have a problem with your eyesight? And she looked, you could have seen a stone drop from her face. It was like, she couldn't believe it. And she was like, actually, yeah, when I was, 3 years old, which in my notes was exactly what it said, because I knew the timing. And it said that she said she went blind in one of her eyes, and it was this huge problem. And it came back, it was okay about a certain time. And I said, yeah, it's exactly what this says. I just noticed it because I was doing just general review, and there was something very stark that was visible. And so I asked her about it. This is before I said anything else to her. And then, she confirmed this. And then I looked at my notes and I said, and it was the left eye. And she lost it. She couldn't believe it because it was the left eye. And it's like, that was just basic astrological medicine. And I'm not any good at that. Like, it's not something that I've spent any particular time on. I still have to go remind myself which body parts correspond to whatever, So it's actually something I'm planning to look into one of these days a little bit more. But I don't want to be, a medical practitioner, so I don't focus on it. But the thing is, what I'm doing is trying to reframe and help reposition, because what's happened, especially because of that Western esoteric tradition, is that people immediately think of divination and this kind of thing, esotericism. So I come from a different perspective with it, having studied this material very extensively. Frankly, as far as I'm concerned, it's just a calendar. But it's a calendar that's just way more useful than you think. And there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, because a calendar that reaches into the future in ways that scientism, I don't think science talks about this because it's kind of falsifiable. Maybe we can actually figure out some ways to make it falsifiable. But it's reaching into the future in a way that scientism says isn't possible. What do you say to that?
Well, I don't even think that's true. So you live this is funny because I know you're in Argentina, so it's winter, but every single you already live under an astrological calendar. You and everybody else, and you take it for granted. It's your calendar is a solar calendar, and here think of it this way: that every spring, we'll just go with that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
The animals will start acting weird. The sky will change. The trees will change. The weather will come, and the only reason you know that is because the sun is in a certain part of the sky, and it does it every year reliably, and you take it for granted. And so that's the calendar. And astrology is actually a solar calendar as well. It just layers on the positions of other planets, which are also equally reliable and predictable. And that's actually, to me, the most important reason to use this calendar, because no one can change it. It's an objective third party.
It's like a blockchain. It's immutable.
Yeah, exactly. And I have an article about that you should read if you haven't, because
I would love to.
This is actually a big reason why I'm kind of working on this at this time. I think in the age we live in, where everyone, just go on the internet, right? Talk to anybody who's on the internet, and you'll discover that people live in completely fantasy worlds, more or less, and have very little cognitive functioning as far as I can tell. And it's because they're not anchored in anything, and they're living in these information cults. And so one of the utilities of this is to center on something that's objective. It's like, look, this is what's happening. It's spring, okay? It's Monday. And when I downplay and I say it's just a calendar, well, there's a whole system of interpretation for that calendar, and that's where things get very interesting. That's where you run into the trouble with scientism. And the truth of the matter is that this is a science that's keeping track of the formation of time. And so when someone says, "Oh, well, can you predict what's going to happen?" It's like, yeah, with maybe 80% resolution sometimes. But it's like, how much? Think about what we're saying we're doing. Like, how are you going to falsify? Like, I'm going to predict Tuesday. Like, what the sum total of events, and even in one person's life. Yeah. Like, that's such a tall order. And so the whole approach that your academic science tries to take, like every 20 years or so, someone cranks out an academic study that claims to disprove astrology. And anyone who knows anything about astrology is laughing. It's just a joke, right? Meanwhile, if you actually use this, it proves itself correct and and predictive, 3 times a day. Like, so if someone deep into it like myself, like I don't even, that's like a clown question as far as I'm concerned. Like I can prove to anybody in 15 minutes that this is predictive. And the question is, what's the level of resolution? And that sometimes is a question, is a trade-off of, how much management overhead is worth putting in.
Okay, question out of left field. How are you using AI, large language models in it? Because, and let me set it up a little bit. I've been working with a counselor who uses astrology, and in that period of working with that counselor, have just like, okay, this is real. This is telling me things about myself only based on my birth date, my birthplace, and the birth time, and it's telling me things that are starting to make my past make sense, and also have some sort of prediction about the future. And so as he's been doing these readings, which I love, I'll just mention the guy, it's Paul Publisher on Twitter, Zeitful, maybe you know of him. And so as he sends these hour-long audio readings, I use AI because one of the big things that large language models do is they help me get a transcript, and then I put it into the LLM and I can sort of mine the thing for information. One recent discovery I got with the LLM is that it hallucinates still, specifically when I ask it for that interpretation layer and even some of the ephemeris and all the dates and all those things. I would love to learn about all that.
Ephemeris is what you're talking about.
Ephemeris. And the ephemeris is just the position of the sun, the moon, all these different things inside of the zodiac. So as it relates to the constellation, is that right? I
got one right here. It's just a book that lists every day the placement of the planets, and now that's mostly digital. So if you use a software tool to cast a chart, it has a digital ephemeris in it. And this is a huge advantage for us in this era, by the way.
But then the question of accuracy comes into it, and we can talk about it. But before that, how are you using the LLMs, if at all, in this process?
I think we're still early on that. The utility is there, but my expectation with what AI and astrology is going to do, I think it's going to take a couple years, but I think it's going to be much more significant than a lot of people understand. So right now, the actual work of interpreting a human's life or human events as indicated by the calendar, the level of thinking and symbolic understanding, that the kind of connections for meaning that a person has to make, that's definitely beyond the capability of any LLM that I've touched. But they're very useful for consolidating information. Right now, you can go on, frankly, the quality of information that's been put into the LLMs on this topic it's mid, okay?
It's bad.
But what's happening is that astrologers are starting to build AIs, and just like with all AIs, the general LLM isn't the key. It's these industry-specific customizations built by actual, experts in the field. They're the ones doing the work, and so there's a few of those out there. I think one to keep an eye on, and one that you might be interested in, is it's called, I believe it's called Hypergate.ai. And that's being done by a prominent astrologer who's got a very good predictive track record. This guy was running around the country telling everyone about the coming pandemic in 2018 and 2019.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, fully on the record, and he sniffed it out. And he's not the only one. Actually, there was several people predicted a pandemic. But so the thing about it is that he has the follow through, and he does seem to have the technical knowledge. So even though I haven't really messed with that yet because I know it's early, that's out there, and that's something you might want to look at. There's a few others out there, but right now it's mostly useful as a tool. Like, for example, like I will sometimes use it when I'm writing and I want to remember exactly when, that's the ephemeris work. Like, when did Saturn go into, Taurus in 1967 or whatever. So that can be really useful. And it can also be really useful to give me a list of interpretations, right? So even though I'm going to interpret for myself, any astrologer like myself is still going to want to read other people's ideas about any placement. And so the LLM can give me dozens of those, and that's really useful.
Who do you go to kind of go into that investigation of what other people are saying? I imagine it's not like, is it a forum? Is it on Quora? Is it on Twitter? Like, where do you go for that?
Well, Quora, I'm gonna say, is not that useful. Let's say, for reasons we can get into. But I have a number of people, and what happens is I look at them, and I decide what it is. But it really comes down to what you're looking for. Like, so there's certain people who can be really great for certain types of interpretation. It's simply a matter of how I feel about the quality of their work. I'll give you just one example. There's quite a few people on YouTube who are useful for this kind of thing. And so sometimes I do this if somebody's asking me, so, hey, I have Venus in Scorpio, what's that about? And I don't want to sit there and give them 20 minutes of stuff. I'll send them to somebody. There's one who I think is very good for this type of thing. She's a woman on YouTube. Her name is Brittany Taylor. I'm pretty sure she's Canadian. She has very, very good interpretations for placements and certain synastry and aspects. So if you want, we call that kind of cookbook astrology, where you're like, I want to know what's Mars in Virgo, which is it's where Mars is right now. She's very good. And so I have people like that I'll recommend, but it really depends on what you're looking for. Whereas if you want a horoscopic astrologer, which is somebody who's going to tell you, not only what's happening in the world, and that's what we call mundane astrology, but also how are you going to feel this week? That guy David Palmer, who goes under the name the Leo King, he's a California guy. I would describe him as an acquired taste, but it's undeniable that he's very good at predicting, and as a horoscopic astrologer, he's excellent. And so I pay attention to what he says, and that's just one answer for you there.
Great, really interesting stuff. There's so many places we can go. I think it really comes back to this Vedic, because what I've noticed in my research so far is I've started to realize that astrology is real. There's a real thing behind it. That it's not only a Western Hellenistic tradition, although I think it feels important to actually follow whatever tradition you've been born into with the culture, because it feels like there's some relation to culture and these systems. And then recognizing that Vedic also has an astrology one, and it's a very important one for their philosophy and their culture. Chinese also has an astrology. Mayans also have an astrology. So there's all these other ones, but Vedic seems to be it's like, for people who are into astrology in the West, it's either Hellenistic or it's Vedic. Can you talk more about, do you actually go and research Vedic astrology? Do you think that has any truth potential?
Oh yeah, I know quite a bit about it, and that split between Vedic and Western is really a product of the 20th century astrology revival. I think that's breaking down now, and this is controversial. You can upset people. Astrologers get very territorial, but I'll tell you straight up, we know now for sure that it's the same system. And we know the transmission. The Indian tradition is very unique and very valuable, and so I'm going to set that up. But first of all, it's important to understand that they're using the same system, and this will blow your mind. And I haven't written anything about this yet, but it's coming one of these days. So consider yourself lucky to hear it. But the Mayan system is also the same system, and you're not going to hear a lot of people say that, because it's not that easy to understand the Mayan system. But I'll tell you, just understand, I've looked at it. We know the transmission history to China and Japan as well. Now, this said, there's every one of these cultures, China, India especially, they do have a unique lunar astrology. And in China, they call it the lunar mansions. In India, I think it's the nakshatras. I forget which name. But that is an independently developed thing. And so the thing is, the actual system that is generally called Vedic, and in India they call it Jyotish, that is using the exact same system as Greece. We know how it got there, and it's really, really great.
Was it Alexander?
It wasn't Alexander. It came later, because what happens is astrology really is actually Alexander's fault, as we know it. At least either the development of this system or the rediscovery of this system, let's say. But we know that the lineage of certain parts of it come from both Babylon and Egypt. And so what happened was, when those cultures were combined, people in Greece who had developed these scientific tools, geometry in particular, in order to interpret it, they merged that together, and then it spread out. And so there was Greek presence, I think it was in Goa, that part of India, in that time. And so the thing is, there's several foundational Sanskrit texts, Philadipka and others. And now that we have translations of all the Greek stuff, we can see they literally are quoting it. And I'll give you another guy. There's a guy, and he's on YouTube. His name is Vic Dakara. And he is, I think, he's an American guy, but I think he's probably, Hare Krishna. And he does he practices Vedic astrology and uses the techniques, but with one important modification. But he also speaks Sanskrit and Hindi, and he reads these books. And so you can actually go and listen to him reading these texts. And so that's a very good person I recommend there. So the deal with the Indian tradition is two things. And the first thing to understand is that the way it's transmitted in India is that you have people that have a school, and it's like an occupation that kind of travels in the family. And so there's dozens and dozens and dozens of schools of astrology there where they have certain rules and kind of ways of doing things and interpretations. And so the problem is that if you try to look that up, is you can find a school of astrology in India that will say, every placement is good, every placement is bad, every combination is good, every combination is bad. You can't just mix and match it very well. So that's the knock. That's the first knock. But that's not a problem. You just have to understand that part of it. Second is that they use what's called, the tradition is to use the sidereal zodiac. And the sidereal is, there's a question, and this is another one that scientism people try to use to discredit astrology. It's really funny because it's like the first thing you might think of, the constellations moved, and because of the precession of the equinox. I can show you 2,000-year-old Greek texts where they basically resolved this problem in astrology.
Yeah,
okay, they knew about this before the stars moved.
Yeah. And
they dealt with it. And the thing is that this is one opinion. Let's say it's not an uninformed opinion, but it's wrong. And so Victor Carr I like that he recognizes that, and so he uses the tropical zodiac. And so the thing about what happens there is that if you have a problem with the zodiac, or if you have a problem with another thing with in modern astrology, something called modern rulerships, where when Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were discovered, they just kind of threw them into the system arbitrarily. Now, this is fair because they didn't have access to what we have now. They didn't know why this was a bad idea, but it was definitely a bad idea. And so what happens is you get interpretation drift. And so once you start assigning, they said, Scorpio is ruled by Pluto. And so that changed how they interpreted Scorpio and Pluto. And what had happened in India is when you use the sidereal zodiac, because that moves the lines of the barriers of the signs, it's altered how they interpret it, because sometimes they're interpreting a placement that's actually in Sagittarius and they're ascribing it to Scorpio. And so this is part of why there's all these different traditions who can't agree. So that's enough criticism of Indian astrology. Now here's the really great part. They have an unbroken tradition, unlike what I described earlier with the West, and they preserved a ton of techniques and methods that were completely lost. And so they use all kinds of stuff that, first of all, now that we've retranslated the old Greek stuff, first of all, we know that the Indians were doing a bunch of things right that nobody in the West was doing correct. They understood prediction and the basic stuff way better. The only reason they weren't predicting the whole world is because of these mistakes that I mentioned. But in terms of the actual technique, they're using the right system. And they have a bunch of things that they've integrated that has to do with how they like to use it. Like, for example, in India, matchmaking is generally done with, it's a country where they still do arranged marriages. And the main way that matchmake is through astrology.
Wow.
Yeah, they use this to figure out whether these two people are going to be compatible. Wow. And that's why it works.
Yeah.
And they use sophisticated, what's called, divisional charts. They use these things that aren't known at all, and we don't have any source text for. But we know because they persist in the Indian tradition, those books exist somewhere, and they'll probably be translated one of these days. I bet these books exist. But they've preserved a whole lot of things that are really useful, and there's a lot of beauty there. So any good astrologer, whether they practice Western or not, has studied the Indian stuff and has some idea about it. And I think I just gave you a lot of information about it, so that's probably enough answer for that. Yeah.
So I want to talk about the Christian sort of take on astrology, and it's all wrapped up in the book that I was talking about, which is by Francis Yates, who talks about Giordano Bruno, who's this Italian guy who's part of the church, and then is like, fuck that, I'm going to go do some Neoplatonic magic, and then basically discounted Christianity. And so there's this sort of reaction, and then you have the Protestants coming in. The Protestants were like really against the magic and really against everything they considered esoteric and occult. So, and I remember this great line I got, I think it was just a random person on Twitter, talked about Dante and his levels of hell. And Dante had a level of hell for the astrologers because the astrologers tried to predict the future. And we should essentially just let God have his will. You know, I think there's like something to that about predicting the future for gain. Rather than understanding the context under which the now is happening and use these tools that God gave us in order to do all these different things. Can you talk about your understanding of what happened with the Christian church? And I'll go a little bit more into it. The Christian church feels like it has a sage who's also a magician named Jesus, who was probably one of the most powerful sages, who's God, basically. And had his magic, and then they instituted their version of that and then discounted everything else, and including taking pagan things. And maybe we could talk about the pagan sort of relationship between Christianity and that. What's your take on all that I said?
Well, it's a huge topic of which there's things I won't say that I know, let's say. But let me start with, first of all, it's important to make a distinction between Jesus Christ, Christianity, and the church.
Yep.
And that's not to criticize the church, but they have a different function.
Yep.
And so I don't take issue at all with the, not universal or constant, but at certain important periods of history, very much so, and probably again in the near future, the church has generally been against the practice of astrology, but not in the way most people think. And that has to do with the role of the church. So the job of a church is to maintain and cultivate the morality of the people, and to maintain the integrity of the community at the ground level.
Yeah,
and if they observe in their responsibility, if they observe that the average person simply cannot handle the shades of gray and the complexity of this, then that sets them up to be taken advantage of. And that's what happened and happens and was happening a lot. That's gone away the last year or so, but that was happening a lot as well. And so what happens is a lot of people use astrology to sell fortune telling and divination. And I'm not a fortune teller. Yeah. And so this is actually a big part of the work I'm doing.
Can we go into that? What is it? That means that essentially gain through the process of gain, somebody will predict the future.
Right. And it's just a question of information asymmetry. And that can be just the person doesn't know, and it also can be they can't understand. So the practice of getting rid of people, basically telling your flock to not give money to people that are promising you they'll give you the future. And also a lot of those people were esotericists. In India, I think this is one of the criticisms of a lot of Jyotish astrology, is that they'll sell you a potion to resolve it. That's not astrology. In fact, one of the first things I put out, and you can find it on my website, is a short thing, and I put this on X as well, what astrology is not. And I pull out and I explain that there's a huge amount of local, cultural, religious traditions that have been grafted onto this calendar and this interpretive science that are maybe useful. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do that at that time, but you have to understand that that is not astrology. That is cultural practice that's local, that's being associated just due to the fact that they were each other for a couple hundred years in an important place. So that's the first thing there. Second is that the coming of Jesus Christ was famously predicted by 3 Persian astrologers. Yeah. And there's some quotes where he says the sun, moon, and stars are basically a calendar that you can use as a guide. And I mean, I've read the Gospels, and that's the actual word, right? Not the word of men, interpreting and whatever. And there's no thing there, but there are the main issue within the Christian idea with the problem with astrology has to do with the idolatry issue, which is these people who like to think that Mars is actually the god ruling this, and he's beaming down no. And that's, you go on like Twitter or something, you'll see people saying, oh, I'm like this because of my Venus. No, but that's not good astrology either. And so I think that commingling of things has to do with that. And I think it's probably a good practice for the churches to discourage people who, one of the things what Jesus is saying is you don't need this. Okay. And that's not wrong. You don't.
Yeah.
But some people can make use of it. And I don't think that's verboten. And finally there, something that I'll have writing about in the future, let's just say, but I'll give you a little preview of it. But think about the period of history we mentioned. So the Hellenistic period, it's about 320 BC, and it goes up into 0 AD, and Jesus is supposed to have been born around that time. That's why that's why we switched it to AD, right? That's 0 is approximately the year of his birth. And I won't get into predicting when Jesus was born. All I'll tell you is that he wasn't born on December 25th. And every single astrologer can tell you that.
Yeah.
And that's also not what the Christian church claims.
Yeah, it doesn't.
But so it's not like a problem. But think about the fact that the people of the world, and in this part of the world especially, studied the world. They were asking the question is how to understand what is the formula that goes into life. And like you mentioned before, the coolest thing you can do with astrology is to understand the meaning of the past. And that's much more interesting than future prediction. And it's much more valuable than trying to guess what's going to come. That's just kind of useful to know. But being able to understand the building blocks of the events that have occurred, of which you have real information, that's much more useful. And so that's what the people studying this science in the Greek period were doing. And so they were asking the world, show me a way. And then, as soon as they pretty much had it locked in, down comes the man.
Yeah.
And so that timing of those two, nobody ever talks about how one led into the other.
Yeah.
And that's all I'll say about that for now.
Yeah, beautiful. So let's what I like about your tweets is that you talk about these things. You gave me a great insight into the mRNA vaccine that kind of made me about the adipose tissue, about how it was the mechanism that they finally figured out how to make the delivery part of it, which is really interesting. And so recently you've been talking about December 21st, 2020, and then how it relates to what just happened in June 15th. And then we've got June 20th coming up tomorrow in terms of like a solstice that seems pretty important. So if you feel like sharing, what do you think happened in 2020, in March 2020?
Well, what that, just to fill anyone in, there's a 20-year cycle. This one is a more important 20-year cycle than they usually are. And it begins at the very end, December 20th of 2020. And in that 20-year cycle, you have it's broken up into basically 5-year segments, 4 of those. And so when the conjunction happens in December 2020, that's the beginning of a 20-year cycle. And so right now, just this last week, we've hit that first checkpoint. And so there's a lot of meaning. And by the way, this is exactly what the Mayans did, by the way, in case you wanted. And this wasn't an accident. Okay, you can look, this is not hard to verify. But anyway, so what that means is that we have a 20-year story that's playing out. And we've just reached kind of like, I like to use the theater play, the stage play metaphor. So in the first act, you introduce characters and setting. And then in the second act, you introduce the conflict, which is the plot. And then the third act is the resolution. So in this case, we have 4 parts, but it's the same idea. So in December 2020 is, according to the system, is telling us this is when the characters and the setting are introduced. And these things are going to be important later. And right now is later. And so just going back to what we just said about how this can give us meaning. So I know that one of the things that happened that week of December 20th, 2020 was when the mRNA vaccines were introduced. And so whether or not, now right there, I'm just telling you, all I'm doing is looking at a calendar. I've made no judgment about whether that's good, bad, effective, safe. It's not. But, you don't need any of that. It's just like, it's just on the calendar. That was Sunday, and we're being told by this calendar that Sunday's fucking important. And so one of the things that we can do now is figure out what does that mean. So I happen to think that the specifics of that event are not necessarily as important as the bigger meaning. And so to me, the significance of that, because the other thing that I mentioned in that post, and this is the other thing that I think is critical to now, is that was also when the election in 2020, which was famously disputed for good reason, and if you don't know that yet, you've simply been unwilling to inform yourself on the topic, okay? Like, I'm too smart to allow someone to tell me, I know too much about statistics and things to be like, oh, there's nothing there. Come on, be serious. You're not a serious person if you refuse to have a discussion about that, because it's like, come on, it's get, I was saying I was there for the election in 2000, and 2004 election was stolen. People, they stole Ohio from John Kerry. Anyway. So the point is, if you can't see the evidence and the statistics for that, but the point is that it doesn't matter if it happened or not. What matters is in both cases, it doesn't matter if the COVID vaccine was, sterilization poison or a great technological innovation, which is probably both. But I think what this is telling us, because this is a conjunction in Aquarius, blah, 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 I see that it's the diverging viewpoints and the effect on the culture that these two events at the same time created. So the refusal of people to acknowledge the dodgy data in the election, and up to the Supreme Court, okay, that had a huge impact on the political environment that we're in now, and the credibility of political views and social views and all that. The censorship on the internet, the control of information. There's so many things that are directly downstream of that. January 6th and all the fallout from that, that's downstream of that. That's caused by that. Yeah. And so my opinion of that at the time and today was that the Supreme Court had a duty to act in that case, because they were the only body who could act. And what they should have done was, they didn't want to change the election. They should have taken the case and issued a lousy ruling and ruled against Texas. But that wasn't the problem. It wasn't about who won. The problem was that they refused to do their job, which was to take their case. Right. And so that was a big problem for the United States, in my opinion. And I've thought that since then. And it's like, I tell you, I said they should have just, kicked it down the road, but they needed to take the case. And in the case of the vaccine, of course, the real issue there was how they tried to impose the requirement on the people. I lived in different places where there's rules but that you were banned from having a job. You were banned from having an education in universities. That was actually very enforceable. I know many, many people whose careers were completely ended by that. Schools and all, there's all these different things, but there was a huge amount of social impact from that situation. And so I think if you look at where we are today and you look at those events, well, the social impact is loud and clear. And so the way people are reacting to what's going on now is directly resulting from that. But astrology is also very literal. And so those two specific events will definitely be on the table.
So one of the biggest personal struggles I've been having is just relating to the fact that I was aware of all these things as they were happening. I was talking about them all the time. I was sort of expecting people to be like, wake up and please realize what is going on so that we can sort of save our civilization. That's how big it kind of felt. And then nobody ever did. And so, and it's still to this day, I can't have those conversations with those people that I thought were my family and friends. They're still my family. I do my best to forgive them, but it's like, it's not happening. Well, maybe it will happen in like 5 or 10 years or something like that. But that's the time scale at which it seems like happening. So there's some percentage of the population that is maintained awareness during this whole time. But for the most part, it's all fantasy land, and it's either fantasy land for scientism or it's fantasy land for, Matrix. Agent Smith is going to bang down my door, and they got the aliens and the pyramids, and maybe some of that stuff is real. Maybe some of it's metaphor. But it's like those are the two lands of fantasy, and there's not many people that are able to navigate those two fantasies in a way that seems integrous and beneficial to the future. What do you think about that?
We live in a very,
Yeah.
very important historical moment.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that the calendar
Yeah.
is telling you. And when I say that, I'm talking 800,000 year cycles, layering 500-year cycles, all happening at the same time. This is definitely, okay, I'm going to give you a December 20th thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So, because if you understand the historical page turn that you're on, then this makes sense. Is the destruction, because what you're talking about is a loss of belief and faith in the model of the world. And so when that goes away, everyone starts choosing other ones, and they're not agreeing very well. And so we're in the very early stages of that. But you may have heard about how the Aztec calendar, the Mayan calendar, said the end of the world was December 12th, 2012, right? Yeah. Well, they were right. They were correct. It was. But it wasn't what people think. So I'm going to give you a couple pieces of information. First of all, they say it was like the seventh world. Okay, it was like, well, the end of the world, if it's happened 7 times, well, obviously it's not, the comet comes down and destroys the planet. It's describing just a complete turning over. And they weren't being fancy. They were like, well, we have this like long calendar, because that's one of the things they have. It's like 2,600 years. And they're like, well, it's starting over again. So that's obviously a big deal. That was all it was. Okay, but the other thing, and this is what most people don't realize, is that the Mayan calendar is based on Venus. And Venus has a very orderly orbit. And it has all these very interesting patterns. And one of them is that every 8 years, Venus almost exactly repeats its position. And so there's these 8-year cycles. And if you find anything in your life that seems to happen every 8 years, bang on Venus for sure. And once you look for it, you'll see it all the time. And so a Venus cycle in the long sense lasts for 8 years. And so on the long calendar, the Mayan calendar that predicted the end of the world, this was a long calendar for Venus cycles. And so the last day of the world began on December 12th, 2012. Or December 21st, 2012, right? Sorry. Yeah. December 21st. Okay, but what you didn't know was that the day, the increment known as a day in that calendar is 8 years long. Okay, and what was 8 years later? Exactly 8 years. Okay, so was December 20th, 2020, which is the date that I just told you about. Okay, so yes, that was the end of the world. So that December...
But it took 8 years.
Yes, that was the end of the last day was 2012 to 2020, and we've been in this new period since 2021.
Okay, so that's a really interesting point, because you talked about lunar calendars.
By the way, you will not hear that from almost anywhere else.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
and
top
so you talked
tier
about
info.
Lunar calendars. Everybody has their lunar calendars, and that was sort of innovated, for lack of a better word, by each of the different cultures. Then you have the Mayans, who have created a Venus-based calendar. And it made me just kind of realize that the whole conception of a day, and also what I'm getting from you is the conception of a calendar, is I can do a lot of research because I'm fascinated by the start of writing. Now I want to understand the start of calendars, and it feels like it's all related, basically. But that's a tangent we can go on later. But we can have different calendars based on every single astrological object. Is that right?
Well, the lunar calendars are very interesting because they're very distinctly different. So if you've ever been outside at night, you've seen the moon, and you can just imagine, pre-electricity and all that. The moon and the cycle of the moon, because the moon makes a circle every month. So it's very easy in any individual's lifetime to see, wow, that pattern isn't there. And so it's completely obvious that they would have all figured out, well, this is a useful timekeeping tool of some sort. And so they developed totally different systems. So the Indian system, the Chinese system, other ones, they're completely different, but they're all versions of trying to figure out what does it mean when the moon is in this place or that place. But we can tell that those are natively developed. Whereas the system of using the entire set of planets that I'm talking about is clearly the same system that got transmitted. And for reasons that will have to be explained later, the Mayans had the same system. But they, like in the same way that the Indians preserved and had a lot of really original stuff, basically, that nobody knew about in the West, well, the Mayans had, I think the source material that they were working for was much better than what anyone else had. So one of the big things they developed was this Venus-based calendar. But this is very complicated to explain. But what happened was they were valuing different things. And so they decided that the pattern of Venus for them was so important that they built a whole separate long calendar just around that. And why they did that and how they came up with what they did, because I've studied it, and this is something that is on my list of things to do over the years. Yeah. It's down the road because it's a lot of work, but I know just enough to know that what they did is super, super interesting. But the amount of source material is very limited. In fact, I have, right here, I have these codex, okay? There's only like 6 of them. Yeah, well, there's not a lot of information.
A podcast guest yesterday told me that there are only 6 codexes, or a very small amount, essentially because when Cortez came, I think it's Cortez, came, he destroyed all the other scrolls. Is that accurate?
Well, I'd love to just quickly disabuse some people of how that happened, because first of all, Cortez did not do that. But famously, there's a friar, I forget what his name was. He was a church guy. Okay, this is like 10 years after the Spanish got there. So first thing you should know, because this is really funny, this is a very relevant topic of conversation. And just so you know, my family comes from New Spain, right? And so I know all this history better than most people because I cared about it enough to go learn. But one thing that is not well known in America, is in English, is that the whole Spanish conquest of Mexico is extremely well documented, right? They wrote down everything. And from the very day they got off the boat, okay, so there's not any reason to be like mysterious about it. Like, you can get these answers without trying. And the thing is, people in Mexico know this, right? It's their local history. Okay, so what happens there is that one of these guys who's in charge in Mexico City, the church guy, he decides to burn their books. He writes it down, and he famously says, I burned all their heretical texts, and this brought them great anguish. He describes how pissed they were about it, right? And the thing is, so he sends this letter back to Spain, and they immediately respond. This is what, so the Spanish and then the church get this letter, and they immediately send a guy to fire his ass. They're like, are you out of your mind? Right. Yeah. This guy was a pariah. He was going to be basically given capital punishment for it. And so what happened is, so to save his own ass, this guy then had to go in and he starts a project to kind of restore this legacy. So he hired a bunch of the scribes from Maya culture there. Beautiful. And he had them write books. And some of these codex we have are his work. So he got them to do it. But most importantly, he tried to catalog the language, the characters, and the hieroglyphic writing they did. And he got it wrong, but the work he did to get it written down and indexed was what was used by a Soviet guy about 100 years ago to crack the code so we could read it. So if that guy doesn't do the crime, a horrible crime, for which he's immediately punished, and to cover his ass, he tried to do this other thing, which ended up being very, very useful. Yeah. So that history, most people don't know that, but it wasn't the Spanish policy. They were not happy about it.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about that because I'm obsessed by knowledge management, which is probably not a term that would mostly be used for conquistadors, because what you just said is that they did value knowledge management and they did value documentation. And where did that come from? Did that come from the kings of Spain? Who was making sure that things got documented?
I mean, I had an auntie who used to say that the Spanish were the original bureaucrats.
Oh, interesting. Because of the gold, because they had large empire. Is that right?
I think they were mercantile. I think it was just their business, the way they did things.
Yeah, interesting.
And so they just like to write everything down. And
it was probably because the Arabs probably also, because that was where a lot of the rediscovery was happening, was through Spain.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it wasn't. They were just they were just Europeans. They were developed,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
they had a good language and writing, and they wrote things down. And I think the reason people think otherwise is because the English spent 500 years slandering the Spanish, and this is document. It's called the Black Spanish whatever, and they basically buried all the history of the Spanish Empire in order to elevate the English Empire. And so the reason people in the Anglo world don't know any of this stuff, and they believe all kinds of things that are definitely not true about the Spanish. Now, the Spanish did plenty of bad things. I'm not trying to be like repping my people here because I have a Spanish name, But they weren't, it's not that they weren't like, what you believe they did is probably not right. What they actually did is much more interesting. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, but it's not what you think it is, because what you think it is was lies put out by the British.
You just gave me a good, I was going to ask about something else, which is now probably gone. It's gone. Let's talk about the psyops. Because I'll share my take on where we are, which is that we're in the information age now, directly in the information age. Industrial age, while still important, is no longer the frame at which we need to see it. It feels like what I've been learning about air signs versus the water signs is related to that. And so now it feels like psyops for the last 120 years. We've built this framework, but as you just accurately mentioned, it goes back further than that, because propaganda is something that's been around for a long time. It's just Edward Bernays turned it into an art into science in the early 1900s, and now we're at the end stage of that. How do you think that changes our media environment? Do you like that small percentage of people that I think both of us agree exists that are sort of not totally lost in delusions on both sides, although there's something to be said that we're all a little bit delusional. For that group of people, it feels like they know what's going on. They know that they've been manipulated, and they're not accepting it anymore. Do you agree? And if so, how do you think that changes our information age, like as Americans, as is it even Americans as the sort of backdrop anymore? What's going to go on with the nation state in the information age?
Well, what you're talking about, the air, earth, fire, water, it's called the elements. And this is actually a concept that can take some time to really settle in. And so it's a little difficult to just kind of quickly break it down. But the way I usually like to do it is say, so the background, I like to use a puzzle metaphor. You've ever made a jigsaw puzzle?
Yep.
Probably. Okay, so you take the box and you dump the pieces out. But what people usually do, and if you don't do this, you're something seriously wrong with you. But the normal thing to do is to find the border pieces and build the border, the outline, right? And then you fill in the other pieces. I'm sure there's some sickos out there who don't do the border first, but that's abnormal, okay?
Really,
so anyway, I mean, because how can you do that? You have to first define the parameters. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's the borders. And so that border, that's Saturn. Okay. And then you put all the little pieces in. And then when it's all done and you see the image, that's Jupiter. Okay. And so these two, that's what that conjunction in 2020 was when those two come together. So it's the creation of a new thing, and the two parts together are able to do that. And so the manner in which they act is going to be defined by that element. And so earth and air and fire and water, they were chosen descriptors because they match what these signs do. And so they're very literal ways to think about it. So coming out of an earth age, so an earth age would be where the pieces actually required something, physical and made of rock, for example. But in an air age, the thing that defines the border is more likely to be light and fast and air and gaseous and move around quickly. So the earth parts will still exist, but like we define the border of a puzzle because we need that physical barrier that we can see and touch. That's an earth thing. And now what's going to happen is those borders and those barriers are going to be made of something that's much lighter and smaller. And I like to point, and we're in this already. And that what you said is the information age is exactly correct. We're at the very beginning of it. It's going to get ridiculous. But my favorite thing, this is a very boomer-coded thing to say when they talk about something like Bitcoin. And they're like, well, I can hold gold in my hand and Bitcoin is not real. And I'm like, actually, it is. You just don't know anything about fucking computers, okay? You have a hard drive. Okay, now go so unscrew it and look at the little platters and then get out a magnifying glass and then 10 more because it's real small. But eventually you'll get to down. You can do this on a CD if you can still find one, right? But it's just little carved ones and zeros on-offs. But they're there. Yeah. Every single digital thing physically exists in the exact same way that a rock does, right? All software... Physically, you can hold it in your hand, and that is the object. And that's a concept that people struggle with, but it's true. There is no digital idea that's, visible like on the internet or anything that doesn't live somewhere, that doesn't physically sit in a place, but it's just made of something very small that can move around quickly and translates itself, right? And this digital, did you know that the word analog was actually invented after digital?
Nope.
Because prior to digital, you didn't analog was just what things were. And then you invented a digital thing and you're like, how do we describe the old stuff? And so I think it's a beautiful term, but most people don't realize it. It was invented in like the 90s. It might have been the 80s, but it wasn't that long ago. But so digital, the thing about it is that it's not a physical reproduction of something, but it's a description that can be reproduced. And so, like, for example, the difference between a vinyl record, which is an analog medium ostensibly, and a CD for music, right? When you play a record, there's a physical needle bouncing off of these grooves in a physical substance, and it's actually it's creating the sound in that little groove, and then the rest of the equipment is just amplifying it. But you can put your ear down to a vinyl record with no stereo speaker plugged in, and you can hear it. It's very quiet. But right, so that's being played, whereas digital, that's not happening. What's happening is that there's a little code stored, information code stored on a disk, and then the computer that's reading it, the laser, is using that to then send a signal to a speaker, which creates it. So the speaker on the CD player is still an analog audio creating device. It's just that it's getting its feed in a translated way. But if you can hear it, it's no longer digital. And so it's just a translation that's happening. And so I think what will happen is as the information proceeds, is people will get more comfortable with the way this goes, because everything's going to be more and more like this. And it's a very hard concept to wrap your head around. I'll give you, in terms of what's going to happen, the best indicator is just to look at the calendar. So this Aquarius period that we just started a couple years ago now, well, it's happened before. This happens every 800 years, the Aquarius one. So when you're doing the calendar, you need to, if you're looking for historical examples, you want them to be as accurate, as closely matching as possible, because as much as the calendar is the same, then that's how close the repeating of the events will be. Okay, and so to go back to the nearest analog is the 1200s, and it just so happens that the last Aquarius age, like the one we entered in 2020, well, that's also corresponds very, very neatly with Genghis Khan leaving the Mongols and starting his conquest. Okay, so this is very interesting for a couple reasons, because you have to know, well, what was that really all about? So in one sense, astrology is very literal. Yeah. And look where Mongolia is, okay? It's literally sandwiched completely between Russia and China, who are their combination, their BRICS, okay? So the alliance of Russia and China is emerging and coming up, okay? That is very on point, and that's often how astrology works in terms of people involved, is you'll find the exact same geographic regions will be represented. So that's the new Mongolians. But what really was important about the Mongols was that they came west and they took out all these really old empires. Yeah. that had been around for 1,000 years. They were old, they retired, and then the hot new guys. And what was their advantage was that they didn't need to carry wagons full of supplies. They could pack and find food on the way. And so they could move much more quickly, like the air. They were lighter, they were faster, their methodologies were completely superior, and they knocked out all the old empires. And so their effect on history was primarily to erase the old empires and then build the structures which dominated for hundreds of years. And the map of the world that you've grown up looking at has basically been defined by the Mongols and the effects of the Mongol conquest. And guess what? That's where you are again. And so if you want to make a bet on... Well, no, I mean, the information age will be... But that was an information age, because they also introduced language systems and writing and all kinds of management. Like, if you really want to use that as a historical indicator, you got to go read the details, because just like the Spanish stuff, the Mongolian stuff is probably not how you were taught it if you speak English and went to school. Like, it's a lot more interesting than you might think. But the really important thing was that they erased the old power system and replaced it with a more efficient system. They brought efficiency, and they brought new ideas and different ways of looking at things. And that is a very similar event to where we are now. And so it's Aquarius, whatever. So there's going to be a lot of repetition there. So I'm suggesting that the calendar says that you should probably not bet on the Europeans over the Russian Chinese right now. That doesn't look very promising gamble. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be wiped off the map, because they weren't, but their old empire, the EU, isn't going to be around in 10 years. And I'd bet $100 on that at a bar any night of the week.
So that brings to two main things we can talk about next time, which is astrocartography, whether that's real and how big that is, because you just mentioned physical locations, and it does seen as the birthplace is so important for the calendar. In general, it seems like there's something there. And then the other thing I would love to talk about next time is the sun cult, how the Mithraeus and just the sun as a unit, which seems to be really important. But that's probably going to spark too many conversations.
We could do a whole discussion about that, and we should. I can answer you a little bit about astrocartography very quickly, because it's definitely coming up, and the big thing that people talk about is using what's called a relocation chart. And it's very useful. And there's something to it. And there's a lot more there than just this. But what I would like to tell people is that the relocation chart, if you cast it, which is what you do, is you take your birth chart and you simply change the location. And then, of course, the time changes as well, because the time was different there. Okay, and you just, any place you can get on the internet, you'll get a good relocation chart. But the chart it shows you isn't like your natal chart. And this is the mistake I think most people make. Your natal chart is the same, which is good. Your relocation chart is going to tell you what you're doing there. So the mission you have there. So if you live in one place and you move somewhere else, and then you, especially if you've left, and so that was like a 5-year era of your life, you lived in this place. If you look at the chart of the relocation and you read it like a natal chart, you can see what you were doing there. And it's very, very funny how on point it's going to be. It's going to tell you what your motivations were, what your project was there. And so it can be really useful if you're thinking about moving somewhere, is because, well, what does it tell you you're going to be doing there? And is that in line with what you're thinking about? And okay, that might be the right place to be.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much. And everybody go check out ctlucero.com. Maybe also if you want people to check out your Twitter. I know I've appreciated your post there.
Yeah, there's links and stuff. And ctlucero.com, since most people don't know that name.